welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helper Parker, and I am super excited to have Dr. Justin Lehmiller back on the show to continue our conversation that we began regarding this new book that he wrote, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. I found it a fascinating read. I'm, of course, very curious about what people are thinking about and turning them on. I get a lot of questions around that kind of those kinds of themes in my practice. And I think especially a lot of times couples in particular who are in relationship with each other can feel like maybe their partners or their own desires or fantasies are weird or perverse or strange or all those kinds of things. And it's kind of nice to have a very compiled book that basically lets us all know that for the most part, I think we're pretty normal in what we're thinking about. And there's some themes even and some ideas about how all this kind of pans out in our culture. So I'm excited. Dr. Lehmiller is a social psychologist. He's a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. He's an award-winning educator. And I'm just really excited to have him on the show. So welcome back.
Hey, Natasha. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's great having you last time. We talked about a lot of great things. So if you missed it, make sure that you catch part one. Okay, so I want to dive into today. We talked about it briefly last time, but you did mention some differences that came up between people who are born female versus people who are born male in regards to how their fantasies pan out. And this is in particular of interest to me because I think in our culture, we oftentimes really polarize men and women. Like, oh, men are so different than women, and women are so different. The kind of classic was that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And and in a lot of ways, I see that really unhelpful because it's kind of like we're pitting enemies against each other and men will always do this, women will always do that. And in my practice, of course, those stereotypes don't always come to light. So there's a lot of mix between those things. But at the same time, I think it's good to know if there are some slight differences. And I just love for you to give us some context about what you found in your study.
Sure. So certainly men and women had a lot in common in their fantasies. Most of the things that men had fantasized about, women had fantasized about as well, and vice versa. But there were some differences. For example, when it came to things like group sex fantasies, men were more likely to have those fantasies and to have them often. And when it came to the sort of emotional fulfillment fantasies about romance and intimacy and passion, women were more likely to have those fantasies and to have them more often. A couple other areas where there were differences, women were more likely to have BDSM fantasies than men. Women also had more fantasies about, I guess, what I call sexual flexibility. So where women's fantasies might have been a little inconsistent with their sexual orientation. So heterosexually identified women had more same-sex fantasies than heterosexually identified men. But some areas where men's fantasies were different were men had more of what I call the gender bending fantasies, where they had more fantasies about cross-dressing or having sex with a transgender partner. Men also just in general had more taboo sexual fantasies than women did. So there were differences in a few areas.
And do we have any ideas as to why this might be the case, right? So is this like nature versus nurture type stuff? Is it that we're socialized as females or males to have certain ideas about our sexuality due to femininity or masculinity? Or do you think there's really something different and men have slightly higher levels of testosterone, women have more of the estrogen going on? So what, or do we just not know? These are just not, maybe your study didn't ask why, it just said this is the difference.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's really hard to know what accounts for gender differences. And I consider myself to be a biopsychosocial theorist, meaning that I think there's probably a contribution of biology and evolution. There's also a contribution of our own unique individual psychology. And then there's also a contribution of the social and cultural environment that we find ourselves in. So in the book, I kind of talk about how all three of these different factors might be contributing to why we see differences, not just based on gender, but on other demographic features as well. So, for example, there are some evolutionary theories that try to explain why men have more group sex fantasies than women. There are also sociocultural theories that try to explain why women might have more passion and romance fantasies because maybe they're socialized associate emotion and sex more closely than men are. So it's hard to say exactly what explains these differences, but I think with most things, when it comes to sex, it's complex.
Mm-hmm. And by evolutionary theory, you mean for men in particular, the more sperm you get to spread around, the better off your chances are of surviving, your DNA surviving.
Right. And that's sort of the evolutionary theory, is that, we are motivated to produce as many children as we can who carry our DNA. And so the thought with men is that, maybe they experience what some evolutionary theorists call sperm competition. And so when there are cues of multiple males competing for access to the same female partner, that this promotes behaviors that are designed to help their sperm outcompete those of other men. It's an interesting theory, and there is some evidence in animal species that sperm competition exists, but in humans, the evidence is a little bit more elusive.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so when you talk about BDSM fantasies that women tend to lean a little bit more strongly on, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Mm-hmm. So women had more fantasies of almost all types when it came to BDSM. The one exception was really in dominance fantasies. So women had more fantasies about bondage, more fantasies about submission, and about masochism, which is masochism is where you derive sexual pleasure from the experience of pain. So dominance was really the one case where women did not have more of those types of fantasies than men did.
Okay. Where there would be more equal, you're saying, or even lesser than with the
Mm-hmm.
dominance. So more the submissive roles is where they showed up.
Right. Yeah. So women were higher on the submission fantasies and the masochism fantasies compared to men. That's not to say that men didn't have them, because most men also reported having submission and masochism fantasies. It's just that women had them more frequently.
Right. And then what about this kind of common myth that you hear, men think about sex so much more often than women, right? So like, given, I don't know where this comes from. I think it's a study somewhere where they want to say that, a man has a sexual thought like almost every minute or every few minutes or something along those lines. Anything along the frequency of the thought of having sex?
Mm-hmm. So, that idea that men think about sex like, I think every 7 seconds, numbers that you might hear. But, the reality is that nobody's thinking about sex that often, because if you're thinking about it that often, you wouldn't have time to think about anything else. You'd never
That's what I
get anything done. There was actually, interestingly, a study of college students a few years ago where they gave them these tally counters and they had them, press a button every time they had a sexual thought. And what they found was that on average, men thought about sex twice an hour and women thought about sex once an hour. So certainly people think about sex a lot, but it's nowhere near as often as we might think they do.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's good. Because again, I'm oftentimes feeling like I'm trying to fight these stereotypes, right? That in particular, that men are sex crazed and women are, kind of more reasonable and things. That just seems to be a very common theme. And that's why I lean towards pointing out our similarities more than our differences.
Yeah, and I think what the research suggests is that men think about sex less than the stereotypes would suggest, and women think about sex more than the stereotypes would suggest. There still seems to be a gender difference on average, but it's just not as extreme as what people think it is.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Okay. And then any thoughts about men and taboo fantasies? And maybe what do you mean by taboo fantasies? I mean, you did mention the gender bending ones. Anything else in particular that comes to mind?
So a lot of the fantasies that psychiatrists and psychologists consider to be paraphilic, and paraphilia is a term that refers to unusual or uncommon sexual interests. Many of those fantasies, or most of them, were more common among men than they were among women. So that would include things like voyeurism, where you're spying on somebody else who is undressing or having sex without their knowledge. Also exhibitionism fantasies, where you're exposing yourself or putting on a show. Those types of fantasies were more common among male than they were among female participants.
Okay. What about the who? You had a chapter on who people fantasize about. Were there differences between males and females in that regard?
Mm-hmm. So the one person who is most likely to appear in your sex fantasies, regardless of your gender and sexual orientation, was, if you were in a relationship, your current romantic partner. So that was a finding that held across all demographic groups. And if you were single, the person who was most likely to appear was an ex-partner. So it's not the case that people are primarily fantasizing about celebrities or unattainable people. Most of us are fantasizing about somebody that we know and know pretty well. And I think that's because for both men and women, our fantasies are often about not just the sexual act, but meeting some deeper emotional need. We often want to feel wanted or desired or validated. And it's just a heck of a lot easier to experience those emotions if you know the other person who's in your fantasy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Anything that you noticed as far as race or culture or orientation, anything that those types of demographics as far as who we fantasize about other than the primary partner?
Mm-hmm. So there were some interesting race-related effects that I saw that suggest that broader cultural biases about race might creep into our sexual fantasies. So for example, when you look at the most fantasized about celebrities, by and large, they tend to be white. And when you look at who people are fantasizing about based on their racial or ethnic identity, you see that whites are the only group that are primarily fantasizing about their in-group, other white people. You see that for other racial groups, some of them actually have an out-group preference. So for example, a large majority of the Asian American participants I surveyed were fantasizing about whites. So I think what you're seeing there is that, whites in our culture in the United States have the most social and political power. They are able to set sort of the standards for attractiveness and sex appeal. And I think that is creeping into our fantasies.
Interesting. So white people are mainly fantasizing about other white people,
Mm-hmm.
but people of color might be fantasizing in their own group setting and also fantasizing about white people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no other racial group that I studied where they showed a strong in-group preference. And in fact, in many cases, they were fantasizing about out-groups more than they were their in-group.
Right. Well, which really speaks to how important it is to have everybody represented, right, in our media and all of that, because so much, I think, of why those fantasies develop are because of what we're subject to. And so when we don't see ourselves reflected back to us, it can be hard to develop those types of fantasies. So I think we need to continue to work on that for sure. Okay, so you came up with, did you have a thought about that? Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say one other thing was that I did some follow-up analyses. This isn't in the book, but I did some analyses later to look at there were differences in red states and blue states based on interracial fantasies. And what I found was that in states where there's more racial equality, I guess you could say. So in the bluer states, people are more likely to have interracial fantasies. So that kind of speaks to your point about how, sort of at the cultural level, if there's more acceptance, more integration, that might change the nature of our fantasies and who we're fantasizing about.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. That's really good. All right. So you came up with 15 questions that, in essence, like if this is true about you, then this may or may not correlate with some of the ways that fantasies show up for you. So I'd like to go over those as kind of the final part of our interview. One of the final parts of our interview. So the first one was age. So how old you are might depend on where you're at with fantasies. And you made a point that, our needs change over the lifespan. I felt it was fairly developmental model type of approach that as we hit different, decades, we might be exploring ourselves differently sexually. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's hard for us to know for sure is whether these are age-related effects we're seeing or if they're generation differences. So that's something that can kind of be hard to tease apart without having longitudinal data. But what my data suggests is that, people at different ages seem to have different fantasies for some reason. And one of the big differences is in the area of group sex. So older adults had more group sex fantasies than younger adults, at least to a point. Group sex fantasies increased till about age 40, stayed high through the mid-50s, and then started to decrease again. So it's not a perfectly what you would call linear relationship where, interest in group sex just increases till you get older and older. But, there's a point at which it does seem to change again.
Any thoughts as to why that might be the case? I think we touched on this briefly, just maybe the need for novelty or difference when you're in a long-term committed relationship?
And I think that's a big part of it, is that as people get older, they're more likely to enter a long-term relationship. For most people, it's monogamous. And it's very hard to maintain passion in a long-term monogamous relationship without introducing novelty. And so I think the threesome and group sex fantasies are one way that people try to kind of amp up the arousal level by introducing something new.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that goes against probably the stereotype that it's younger people that want to have the crazy, wild, group orgies or things of that nature. And that you didn't necessarily see that as a primary fantasy factor in kind of like college age kids or people that in their 20s and 30s.
It was people in their 40s and 50s who were the most likely to have these fantasies. Actually, young adults in general, I would say, tended to be a little bit more what some people would call vanilla in their sexual fantasies, right? Because sex, any kind of sex, is just kind of new and exciting to them. But as you get older and you have more experience, you kind of need something new to keep the arousal level high.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So the second question was, what's your sexual orientation? So depending on your sexual orientation, that might say something about your fantasies.
Mm-hmm. So what I found there was that people who identified as anything other than heterosexual tended to have more diverse fantasy content. So more BDSM fantasies, more taboo fantasies, more gender bending fantasies, more non-monogamy fantasies. So kind of across the board, people who identified as non-heterosexual had more diverse fantasies.
And the number 3 question which is very, of interest to me, of course, here at Mormon Sex Info, is your religious affiliation and how that might, impact your fantasies. And I think a big theme that you noticed was what I quoted, breaking free. So in other words, and I don't know if you even made the distinction between religiously conservative affiliation versus more progressive affiliation, if that makes a difference, or if you even knew, if your study even measured for that per se.
Yeah, so I didn't really break it down further than just looking at whether people had a religious affiliation, really different affiliations, but that sort of gets back to, this is a big complex data set and there are lots of different ways to parse the data. But I found that there were differences just having been based on having an affiliation or not. And so that's kind of what I focused on in the book.
Okay.
But I think you're right that you could make predictions about specific types of affiliations being linked to different fantasies than others.
All right. And so what did you find?
So for people who had religious affiliations, they tended to fantasize more about taboo sexual activities. So the things that they've been told that they can't do, they're more likely to fantasize about doing them.
So the classic kind of forbidden fruit type of idea or the cookie in the cookie jar, right, that you're not supposed to have. So the more that the more we put focus on something, then as far as a no-no, then it might become more enticing.
Right. And there's 2 things there. One is just that it could be this concept that psychologists refer to as reactance, where you're told, no, you can't do this, and that just makes you want to do it even more. Another thing could be that when people have thoughts that they're uncomfortable with, they often try to suppress them. And what we see in the psychological literature is that when people are trying to repress or suppress certain thoughts, sexually or otherwise, it creates this obsessive preoccupation with them where they end up thinking about it even more. So that could also be one of the factors that's driving why they might have more frequent fantasies about taboo acts.
Yeah, this just hits home to me so big because, ever since kind of the internet kind of blew up our whole lives, about the last 10 or 15 years, it has seemed very prominent in our religious kind of over the pulpit type of sermons that they're mentioning pornography. And I mean, like incessantly, like over and over and over again. And even on Easter Sunday, one time I had to listen to a talk on pornography. I was like, I'm not sure I want to think about porn on Easter Sunday. But anyway, my critique has always been that I like the intention is to warn people, right? Like this is bad behavior and sinful and we don't want you doing it. And yet, and regardless of what your values are around that, what I think the unintended consequence is that they're bringing so much attention and focus and anxiety and stress to this particular behavior that they're kind of creating more of the, angst around this, which is a lot of what you're saying. And that's been my experience as a clinical sexologist, within the Mormon population, especially around sexually explicit materials and people's relationships with those.
Yep, and I think you're absolutely right. I
Yeah.
share your view on
So
that.
distressing. So, let's just stop talking about it so much. Okay, so political affiliation. So whether you kind of mentioned a little bit about this, but if you're Republican or Democrat, at least in this country, I don't know if you did independent as well, but that says something about what you might be fantasizing about.
Mm-hmm. So with the self-identified Republicans, the effects there were similar to those who had religious affiliations in that they had more taboo sexual fantasies, also more fantasies about sort of breaking free of the norm of monogamy. So more infidelity fantasies about swinging, and just other ways of sort of introducing multiple partners into a relationship. Democrats, on the other hand, I saw that they had more fantasies about BDSM related activities. So those were really the areas where I saw differences politically.
The Republican one makes sense to me because, again, a lot of self-identified Republicans are also more, part of the religious right movement. But any thoughts about the Democrats and BDSM, how that would be correlated or related? Because the Republican kind of makes sense because a lot of self-identified Republicans are also part of the religious right, or find themselves to be religiously conservative. But are there any thoughts about why people that self-identify as Democrats would have BDSM fantasies?
So I think for them, it might be a function of the fact that within the Democratic Party and Democratic circles, there's this value of equality. Everybody's the same in terms of, having equal power. And so I think with BDSM, you're playing, that's more of a taboo for people who are self-identified Democrats. And it's really ultimately the same sort of explanation as it is with Republicans, where it's, what you're told you can't do is what you ultimately come to want to do. So I suspect that could be what's going on there.
Interesting. Okay. So equality values, then, that the opposite of that would be showing up as inequality power differentials in sexuality. Super fascinating. Okay. All right. So your first sexual experience might have something to do with your sexual fantasies. What did you find there?
So I found that the activities that people reported that took place during their first sexual experience were more likely to appear in their sexual fantasies later on. So it didn't matter what it was, if it was kissing or if it was oral sex or something else. If you did it the first time you had sex, you tended to have more fantasies about that. Also, to the extent that people said their first sexual experience was unusual in some way, they reported more unusual sexual fantasies later on. Now, the one thing that's unclear here is, are those early experiences shaping our sexual fantasies later on, or is it that we just have a recall bias, right? And we just tend to remember information that's consistent with what we're into or what we like to do now. So, that's the one caveat I give with that first experience, that data.
Yeah, or those things we were always into,
right?
Which would have driven our first experiences to begin with.
Right.
Okay, I guess where I would want to just at least mention, because I do like to kind of separate sexual trauma from first sexual experience, right? So I like to encourage people to think about those things as different. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would have shown up in this data necessarily. So if a first experience with your sexuality is criminal in nature and somebody's, being oppressive of you in that regard, is that also what showed up as far as fantasies?
So I didn't look at whether their first sexual experience was victimizing or not. What I did look at was just in general, have you ever experienced sexual victimization, and how was that linked to the content of your sexual fantasies? And I found that there were a lot of interesting links there. One was that people who had experiences with sexual victimization reported more BDSM fantasies. And that was interesting to me because there's a lot of research on BDSM finding that it's not linked to sexual victimization, but that research is based on people who are actually practicing it. And I was focused on people who were fantasizing about it, irrespective of whether they had actually done it. So that might explain why my findings are a little bit different there. But it may be that, this link between victimization and BDSM is some way that people who've experienced a sexual assault might come to terms with or cope with. that experience in some way. I also see that people who had been victimized had more emotional fantasies and more emotionless sex fantasies. And I think that that reflects diversity in the way that people cope with sexual trauma. Some people might fantasize more about being emotionally close to someone else because that creates this feeling of security or comfort that allows them to relax and enjoy sex. Whereas other people might want to strip the emotion away from sex so that they're creating some psychological distance from it. So I think ultimately all of the victimization links we're seeing are just different ways that people might cope with a trauma. And there's nothing problematic or inherently bad about that.
Yeah, we talked more in depth about that in our part 1 interview. So if you're interested in that, make sure you catch that. I thought that's really important to understand that doesn't mean you're broken or that there's something wrong with you just because you organize your fantasies and maybe they were affected by some type of victimization. Well, and that's kind of the number 6. So victim of sex crime, right? So adaptive coping mechanisms. So we kind of covered that. So the number 7 question are you having some type of sexual problem? Can you discuss what you mean by that?
So what I was looking at here was, did people report problems with sexual desire, arousal, orgasm, sort of any problem in the sexual response cycle? And what I found was that for people who had more sexual difficulties, they reported fewer novelty fantasies, fewer group sex, non-monogamy fantasies as well. And I think what's going on there is that if you're experiencing sexual difficulties, you don't want the added element of something stressful in your sexual activities, right? So just basic no-frills sex is kind of after. And when you're adding in a novelty element or something new, you're adding an additional layer of stress. So I think that for people who have sexual difficulties, they tend to play it safe in their sexual fantasies.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's interesting because I think sometimes, especially with when I have the classic presentation of the high desire partner kind of pulling their low desire partner into sex therapy. A lot of times they're thinking, maybe we should try this, maybe we should try that. They're adding a lot of maybes and maybe we just need to settle down and figure out some pleasure and some things that are, that would be more relaxing and more beneficial for the lower desire partner. So yeah. Okay, great. So compulsive urges. So if you tend to be a person who deals with compulsivity, and do you mind, because sometimes I feel like, especially when we talk to the public, that these terms are a little bit confusing. So can you even talk a little bit about how you would define compulsivity?
So the way that I assessed sexually compulsive behaviors, the way I looked at it in the survey, was whether people felt like their sexual behaviors were or fantasies were out of control. Right. So there's a subjective element there where people are labeling their desires as out of control. I think there's an interesting debate to be had there about, are their behaviors truly out of control, or do they just feel like they're out of control because maybe the moral view of sex would dictate that those desires or fantasies they have are problematic. So I think sort of separating out the morality issue from, is this truly out of control, is sometimes difficult to do, which I'm sure you probably see that in your clinical work.
Absolutely. I mean, the work of, I think it's Joshua Grubbs, right, who talks a lot about self-assessment of people who see themselves as addicts, for example, or people who feel they're out of control, tend to come from religiously conservative backgrounds. So it's difficult when the same behavior is seen very differently and impacts your sense of self very differently, depending on the background you come from.
But one of the things I found was that for people who had more of these compulsive sexual tendencies, they tended to have more taboo sexual fantasies. One possibility is that for some of those people, that reflects a variant of obsessive compulsive disorder. So where their taboo activity or fantasy is somewhat ritualistic in nature. So that could be what explains it, but it could also just be that people who might have taboo fantasies might label them as out of control because it's a way of sort of absolving the self of personal responsibility.
Well, and I think too, for some people, compulsive types of behaviors aren't really that tied to pleasure. I think that's another way it's more tied to like anxiety or stress reduction, or even it can cause anxiety, even though they're continuing to behave or think about certain things. And so That might be a helpful way for people to think about that too, that it's not always about, oh, this is super great, super
Absolutely.
fun. It's like there's a lot of stress associated with compulsivity.
Right. And they might be engaging in the behavior very frequently, but never really enjoying it, precisely
Yeah.
because it's just, they're just trying to relieve some anxiety, and that's it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So your current relationship might say something about what you're fantasizing about.
Mhm. So I found that people who were less happy in their current relationship were more likely to fantasize about having an open relationship or a polyamorous relationship. They also have more fantasies about meeting emotional needs through sex. So, sort of the passion, romance, and intimacy. So I think part of what's going on there is that when people aren't happy in their relationship, they're more likely to fantasize about ways of meeting unmet needs, and that could be sexual needs or emotional needs depending on the individual, or both in some cases.
Okay. Anything you found out about people who are satisfied? Does that make a difference? Or we just go back to the idea that we kind of tend to fantasize about the partner we're with?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a big part of it, is that if you're happier in your relationship, you're more likely to include your partner in your fantasy. If you're less happy, you're more likely to have, say, the frequent celebrity fantasies and so forth as well. So there are differences in who you fantasize about as well as what you fantasize about doing.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Yeah, I guess as I'm thinking about that, that's a challenge to non-monogamy lifestyles, because on the one hand, we want to support that for people that decide, that that's a good fit for them. On the other hand, if you're looking at adapting a non-monogamous lifestyle because you're kind of unhappy with your current relationship, that doesn't always tend to bode well. For some people it does. For some people it's like, that's the fix. It's like, oh, these needs that weren't being met now are met through these other relationships. But for other people, it seems like now it blows up their relationship even more. I don't know. That's probably off point, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, and I get what you're saying. I think that for people who are interested in exploring non-monogamy, they really need to approach that from a position of strength within their current relationship. Just adding other partners into the mix isn't going to fix existing problems that are there. So I think no matter what your fantasy is, whether it's non-monogamy or not, you have to start by fixing the relationship issues, the fundamental underlying issues, which are often communication based. And once you're in a good place together, then you can start potentially exploring your fantasies.
Right. Okay. Attachment style. So what does a person's attachment style say about their fantasies? And would people even know what attachment style means?
Mhm. So the main thing I looked at here in attachment style was people's level of attachment anxiety, which is basically whether they have a fear of abandonment. So are they worried that their partner is going to leave them? And do they need a lot of reassurance and comfort from their partners? So what I found was that for people who are more insecure, who are higher in this attachment anxiety, they had fewer fantasies about group sex and non-monogamy, and more fantasies about BDSM and about romance. And I think what's going on there is that people who are more insecure, need more reassurance and so forth, they're less likely to fantasize about non-monogamous sex because they might find those scenarios to be threatening, right? But the reason they might fantasize more about romance and BDSM is because the romantic fantasies might validate them in terms of addressing that reassurance issue, and the BDSM fantasies might offer a form of escape or distraction that lets them forget about the anxiety for a moment and just kind of relax and enjoy the sex.
And how do we make sure that that information isn't used inappropriately? In other words, somebody listening to us saying, see, the only reason why you're not interested in what I want to do is because you're insecure, right? And you just need to kind of get more mature and get more put together so that we can go off and, I don't know, try swinging. I'm trying to come up with an example.
Yeah, so I think attachment is interesting because for a long time, people have kind of thought that your attachment style is something that's stable throughout your entire life. But what we see in research is that it can actually change in response to relationship circumstances. So, if you happen to be someone who's high in anxiety, but you're with a partner who is very secure and who really tries to meet your needs, you can actually become more secure over time. So, it's really more about the dynamic, the interaction between the partners, and making sure that you're meeting each other's needs if you want to try and bring people closer together there. It's not something where one partner can say to the other, you need to change your attachment style, because that's not going to work. And if anything, that's just going to make them more insecure, right? So if you have a partner who is more insecure, more anxious, you as the secure partner need to work to really try and meet their needs. And that could ultimately help lay the basis for more satisfying sex life.
I love that, because I think some of pop psychology in the last 20 years has gotten this kind of message of, you need to work on yourself so that then you can be in a relationship. And I'm always like, what island do we all get to go to where we get to work on ourselves and prepare ourselves for a relationship? Yeah. So I think this idea that we're pack animals, we need relationships, whether some of our attachment is related to how we're being treated and how the other person is engaging. And I think that's perfectly okay, that it's not just, oh, this is all my issue and I'm insecure and you're acting like a jerk or, whatever, but somehow it's all my fault that I'm insecure. So I appreciate that. Okay. Interesting that you noticed the question of being an organized, detail-oriented person and how that might affect your fantasies.
So people who are high in the personality trait of conscientiousness, these are people who are very detail-oriented, they are planners. These individuals have more elaborate sexual fantasies in a lot of ways. So their fantasies focus more on the setting in which sex takes place. So people who are detail-oriented in the real world tend to be detail-oriented in their fantasies. Also, people who are high in conscientiousness tend to be a little bit more conformist in their general attitudes. And so their fantasies in general are a little more conformist as well. So fewer taboo activities and things like that.
Okay. All right. How about if you're outgoing and sociable? So if you're an extrovert, how's that going to show up?
So if you're extroverted in the real world, you tend to be extroverted in your fantasies. You are meeting new people. You're more likely to have group sex and non-monogamy fantasies. Also, people who are extroverted fantasize more about infidelity. And that's interesting because we see in other research that people who are more extroverted are more likely to commit infidelity. And I think that's precisely because they just have more opportunities. If you're meeting more people, there's more potential there for infidelity to occur.
Sure. Okay. What about this caring about other people's problems? So if you're an empathic type of personality, is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I was looking at the personality trait of agreeableness, which is just how much care and concern you have for the well-being of others. And agreeableness is certainly tied to empathy. But what I find is that people who are more agreeable, they fantasize more about meeting their partner's needs. They're more focused on their partner's pleasure. So if you're high in agreeableness, you have fewer infidelity fantasies, fewer emotionless sex fantasies, fewer taboo fantasies, and your fantasies focus more on things that are mutually pleasurable for you and your partner.
Okay. Stress management, how does that play a role?
So that's kind of similar to the attachment anxiety stuff. So people who are high in the personality trait of neuroticism, where they have a difficult time dealing with stress and a little bit more emotional instability, they tend to play it safe in their sexual fantasies. They don't want to fantasize about things that could potentially stress them out, like group sex or non-monogamy. Okay.
And then the last one is self-esteem. So how we feel about ourselves will oftentimes play a role in what we're fantasizing about.
So for people who are low in self-esteem, one of the things I found was that they were more likely to fantasize about passion and romance. So the emotional fulfillment fantasies. And I think that might be a way of sort of addressing that negative self-view that they have. It's sort of reaffirming them in a way. So again, it's sort of this therapeutic function of our fantasies, that they're playing it safe, trying to fantasize about things that are going to just meet their needs so that they can relax and let go and enjoy the experience.
Do you see any potential there? I mean, I think a lot about, in particular, women having to deal with the many messages about body size, body, just how you look. And I mean, men have to deal with that too. It seems like we're definitely more I was talking about both men's magazines and women's magazines have women on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
So it tends to be that way. And so it just makes me think about, again, the relationship with erotic materials that tend to be, for the most part, unless you're really looking for feminist type porn, tend to be focused on male pleasure, tend to be focused more on the female, that the camera is angled more on the female body. And the male is just kind of there experiencing the pleasures, kind of a very typical way that a lot of pornography is I guess, depicted. So how does that, play into that idea of self-esteem for women in regards to their relationship with erotic materials, or maybe their partner's relationships with erotic materials? I guess what I'm getting at is that they might worry, right, that am I in competition then with what's on the screen, and I'm never going to compare to this body that, is obviously like movie star material.
Sure. And I think that relates to something else I talk about in the book, which is how we change ourselves in our sexual fantasies. And what I see is that women are much more likely than men to fantasize about changing their own body in their fantasies. And so that it probably stems from these cultural messages that we give women about, needing to have the perfect body. And ultimately they are changing themselves in their fantasies to give themselves that body that their culture or society tells them they should have. Interestingly, we see that men change themselves in different ways in their fantasies. Men, because there's a lot of pressure on men to have large penises. And so men and women have body anxiety in different ways. And we see that plays out in the way that they picture themselves in their fantasies.
Interesting. That whole segment is just so sad to me. that we're just, kind of always treated as not good enough, by the media, by advertising, by that just seems to be a permeating topic for anyone, for any person.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that's really, I loved all those questions. So I'd like to kind of finish out our interview with kind of your goal. I mean, why did you do this study? I think a lot of what you end the book with is, how does knowing this information help? How does this help a couple navigate their relationship? How can it help with communication? How can it help us may dispel myths, right? Or stereotypes. So what are some of your goals around that? And what are you hopeful people can, if they're going to pick this book up, what can they glean from it other than just satiating curiosity?
Right. So I think there are a few big takeaways. One is that you're probably a lot more normal than you think you are. And people have a lot of anxiety about their fantasies and whether they're normal. And that's one of the big things that prevents them from sharing or disclosing their fantasies with the partner in the first place. So part of it is just really increasing self-understanding, making people feel more normal so that can open the door to more sexual communication, because we see the people who are communicating more about sex, and in particular communicating about their fantasies, tend to be happier. So that was a big thing that I did in this work, was to try to look at the link between fantasy and reality, because there really isn't much, if any, research on it. And what I see is that the people who share their fantasies with their partners, for the most part, are reporting positive outcomes, and that it's improving their relationship. For those who go the extra step and decide to act on some of their fantasies, they're also, by and large, reporting positive outcomes, and saying that it improved their relationship. So I think there's a lot that we can gain from getting more in touch with our fantasies and incorporating them into our sex lives and relationships. Now, there's a lot of caveats here, right? That there are both potential rewards as well as potential risks.
Sure.
When you start sharing your fantasies, you put yourself in a position of vulnerability, and you don't know what other people might do with that information that you share. Also, it's possible that when you act on a fantasy, the experience might not live up to your expectations. And, we're not very good at predicting our future emotional reactions. So, there are potential risks there. So what I try to do in the book is give people sort of a roadmap of what they need to know if they're thinking about sharing, and also if they're thinking about acting on fantasies, so that they can do this in a way that is safe and healthy and mutually consensual and pleasurable.
I love that. I agree with you. Just knowing that we're not as weird as we might think we are can be very helpful in the shame department. And I'm a big believer that we're all healing from sexual shame. I don't know how you survive in this culture without coming out of it with some sexual shame. And then this idea, I think your point of just because you have a fantasy doesn't necessarily mean we're going to act on it. I mean, that's the whole idea. That is what makes the word different from reality, right? And so I think that people oftentimes are so worried about, if you fantasize, if you have that fantasy, that means that you want to do it. And if I'm not comfortable doing that, then now we're going to have a huge issue. Or what does that mean for our relationship? So really understanding that fantasy is kind of like a playground where you get to be creative and have fun together, but doesn't have to necessarily go further than just the two of you and the comfort of your own relationship.
Right. Not all sex fantasies are sexual desires. And it's okay if you don't want to act on your fantasies. Fantasies can be just fantasies, and people can still enjoy their fantasy just by sharing or talking about them with their partner. It can be a form of dirty talk that increases arousal, and that can be all the further it goes. It doesn't have to advance beyond that. So I think this is one of those things where different things work better for different people, and you need to figure out what's right for you, your relationship that fits with your morality structure and your comfort level when it comes to sex.
Yeah, I agree with that. Plus the idea of, I love how you talk about risk and vulnerability, because obviously, yes, when you're vulnerable, you are taking a risk. It can go well, it can go poorly. At the same time, what I hope couples will glean from this is they either, one, share, or how they're choosing to respond to somebody sharing with them, is this idea that the power of just being accepted. I think, at some level, that's a very primary need for all of us, is acceptance, and to share something vulnerable and to have somebody on the other side of that, treat you with respect and honor and curiosity and love. That's, again, an extremely powerful exchange, whether that goes any further or not. Just that exchange can be very powerful, especially if you've been, feeling like you've had to keep a secret or something hidden about yourself. And I think with sexuality, that's how a lot of us are functioning, is I've got to keep this dark, kind of intense part of myself to myself, or people will not like me or love me or find me desirable.
Right. And, when you think about it and you look at the research, self-disclosure is really the way that people build trust and intimacy over time. And sexual self-disclosure can be a really big part of that. So, again, there's just a lot to be gained there by having this open communication, this open dialogue, and it can build trust and intimacy and lay the basis for just a stronger and healthier relationship.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming on our show. And I really enjoyed, like I said, reading this book. I would highly recommend it to everybody. Again, it is, if I can get it up here, it's Tell Me What You Want. And it can really help you understand yourself better, understand your partner or partners better. And it can help kind of end some of this, sexual shame that we've been talking about that's unnecessary and tragic. So I hope you check it out. And any closing thoughts?
Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I think there's a lot here where, this book, I think, can help people with their sex lives and relationships, address a lot of questions that maybe they've never had answered before. Was really my goal in writing this book, because I have a lot of questions myself about sexual fantasies that just haven't been addressed in the literature. So I think there's a lot here for academics, for clinicians, for laypersons alike. There's a lot to learn about our fantasies. I
agree. And you definitely either validated a lot of what I thought, but like you said, couldn't bring it up in the literature, or I definitely learned a lot of new things as well. So thank you for your work, and I wish you the best. And thanks again so much for being on our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms, was as simple as I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary
a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.